Hello and welcome to Nebula Talks. Before we begin, we have a few updates and reminders for you. We would love to have you be part of our Nebula community. And you can do so by logging on to www.nebula.com, where you can join communities related to your area of interest, register for upcoming Nebula Talks, book one-to-one skylifts, and view other upcoming events. You can also take this opportunity to connect with fellow learners or the speaker by sending a connection request. When you connect with the speaker, you will be able to contact them directly as well as receive updates about their upcoming talks. Kindly note that during this session, you will not be able to switch on your camera or unmute your mic. To ask questions during the talk, go to the audience chat, type your question, and select Post Your Question. If your question has not been answered during the talk, you will be notified once it's been answered, or if your question has not been answered during the talk, you can go to www.nebula.com and spin a quest, and your questions will be answered. Thank you for joining us today. We hope this talk broadens your horizons and takes you to new learning heights.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another Nebula Talk. My name is Sarah, and today we'll be discussing and learning how to answer part 2 of the IELTS speaking section. All right, so before we begin, I will just share my screen. And also I have a poll question, and that is, what do you find most difficult about the IELTS speaking section? You can tell me about what you find difficult about the whole section or just part 1, part 2. Since we're talking about part 2 today, maybe just part 2. All right, and I'll just share my screen while you answer. All right, so most difficult thing that you find about the IELTS speaking section part 2, is it that you don't have enough to speak about, or is it that you're nervous or you're conscious about it, or you just don't know what to speak about, or is there something else that you find difficult about the IELTS speaking section part 2 in particular? Okay, you can take your time and answer that question. We'll just get started with today's talk. So, first of all, let's just have a little introduction to the IELTS. Okay, for those of you who are new to the exam, who are just learning about the exam, this will just be a little summary for you. And for those of you who already know about the exam, who have probably already taken the exam and just looking to maybe take the exam again to boost your score, this will just be a recap. All right, so IELTS stands for International English Language Testing System, and it's an exam to test for non-native English language speakers to test your 4 language skills, which are your listening, your reading, your writing, and your speaking. And like we discussed at the beginning, today we'll be looking at the speaking part. Okay, so let's just go a little bit more into the speaking section. All right, the speaking section has 3 parts. And the total time for this section, for the exam, the speaking exam, would be 11 to 14 minutes. So basically, you'll just be speaking for roughly, let's say, rounding up 15 minutes max. All right, and the parts go as follows. It's the first part would be the introduction and the interview kind of question part, where the examiner will be asking for your identification, asking and double checking who you are, and just asking you general questions. And then it goes into part 2, which is what we'll be discussing today, where you're given a topic and you have to talk about it. And then it moves on into part 3, where you're just developing what you were saying in part 2 and going a little bit more in depth in part 3. All right. Okay, so since we're talking about part 2 today and how to answer it, we're gonna go into more detail and go into what is the IELTS speaking part 2. All right. So basically, this is also known as the long turn because you'll be having 2 minutes to speak, and it's just you speaking for the whole 2 minutes, all right? And basically, you're just showing the examiner how you can speak for an extended period of time, all right? That's all part 2 is about. All right, so here's how the process goes, okay? You'll receive a topic cue card. Okay, there you'll have a piece of paper that will be given to you by the examiner, and you'll have 1 minute to prepare. All right, and you'll also have to speak without interruption from the examiner side for a full 2 minutes. All right, the examiner is not going to come in between and ask you anything. He or she is just going to listen to what you have to say for the full 2 minutes. All right, and then after the 2 minutes, the examiner might ask you maybe 1 or 2 follow-up questions. And then it just smoothly transitions into part 3 of the exam, which is the final part of the IELTS speaking section. All right. All right, so let's talk about what the examiner is looking for. And here we're going to talk about a little bit about the assessment criteria. And it's quite important to know what you're being assessed on or how you're going to be assessed, not only for the speaking exam, but for all parts of the IELTS exam. But for the speaking section, the examiner is basically looking for these 4 criteria, which is fluency and coherence, how easily you're able to speak at length, how logically you're able to develop your ideas, how well structured your answers are, things like that. All right, then lexical resource, the use of a wide range of vocabulary, how you are using your language, how you're using idiomatic language, idiomatic phrases, idioms, things like that. And then you have grammatical range and accuracy, where they're looking at how the presentation of your grammar and pronunciation, how well and easily you're understood, how well you use annotation, how well you stress your words or your sentences, and also the pace at which you speak. The thing here is, what happens is when you hear that you have to speak for about 2 minutes, either in nervousness, you start speaking too fast. And what happens there is, if you speak a little too quickly, your band score will drop down. And also, if you speak too slowly, it will also bring your band score down. So make sure that when you're speaking, you have a set pace, you have a set normal pace. How you're speaking to a normal person, just keep that pace. Don't try and rush and get everything into that 2 minutes. Pace out what you're saying. All right, so this is the assessment criteria that you'll be marked on. All right. All right, so now let's look at some typical topics that will come during the IELTS speaking part 2. Okay, so it's good to know that the IELTS speaking task 2 topics are related to personal experiences and life events. So if you think about it, it actually is a bit more easier, because what you'll be speaking about is relating to something that's personal to you. So it doesn't matter what you say as long as you're saying it correctly. So you can pick out, according to the topic that you're given, you can pick out whatever it is and relate your personal experience to that. So here are some typical topics. Typical topics include school, study, or work, important events or changes in your life, places you've been to or what you want to visit in the future, hobbies and free time activities, and goals and ambitions. These are just some. There are many, many more. While you're practicing for the speaking exam, do practice a whole wide range of these topics so that you're not surprised on the day of the exam. All right, so let's look at some sample topic card questions as well. Okay, for example, on your sheet of paper, you can get a cue card which says a beautiful place, and the question could be, describe a beautiful place to visit in your country, and it'll give you some points. So what happens is, when you receive your cue card, you'll have maybe just a brief description of what you have to speak about. So here it is, describe a beautiful place to visit in your country. And then you have prompts. All right, so you should say, or you can say really where it is, how to get there, what there is to do when you're there, and explain why you recommend this place. All right, so this is one example. Another one could be an important choice. Describe an important choice that you have had to make in your life. You should say the following: when you had to make this choice, what you had to choose between, whether you made a good choice, and explain how you felt when you were making this choice. All right, so there's another example. I have 2 more examples for you all. Another one, jobs. Describe a job that you have done. All right, you should say how you got the job, what the job involved, how long the job lasted, and describe how well you did at the job. Okay, and then the last example that I have for you are school subjects. Describe a subject you enjoyed studying at school. You should say when and where you started studying it, what the lessons were like, what made you choose that subject, or what made the subject different from the other subjects, and explain why you enjoyed the subject. All right, so the key things that you should look at when you're getting your cue cards is the what tense it's in. So as you can see, most of it is in the past tense. what you enjoyed or a job you have done. All right, describe an important choice you had to make in your life, or describe a beautiful place to visit. Now, a beautiful place to visit in your country, that's present tense. So always look at the question and see what tense it is so you know how to answer the question. All right. Okay, so now let's move on to some tips that you can use for the IELTS speaking section 2. All right, so first of all, make notes before you talk. Before section 2 even begins, what happens is once you get your cue card, once you get your topic card, the examiner, and there'll be instructions written on the paper that you'll have 1 minute to prepare, and then you'll have to speak for 2 minutes. Now, what happens is, this is the 1 minute preparation time that you get is where you'll make all the notes before you talk. So you can make notes on your sheet of paper. Do bring a pencil and or a pen if you want to the exam hall. So you can note down the different points. So according to the prompts, according to the question, you can note it down. All right, do use your 1 minute preparation time wisely. This is where you'll be able to structure your answer, structure the flow so that everything is in order. Because again, what happens is it's not only part 2, this part goes on to part 3. So the ideas that you've developed in part 2 go on to part 3. So make sure you're kind of thinking about that as well, how you can transition from part 2 to part 3, and make sure that you have all the points noted down. All right, so use that time wisely. Second one, memorize a good opener. Now this is quite important. Now, when we say memorize, this tip only goes towards certain phrases that you should learn, not the entire thing that you want to say. Okay, so you need to remember that the whole speaking exam, part 1, part 2, and part 3 of the IELTS, is supposed to be a spontaneous conversation between the examiner and you. All right, the examiner will know if you have memorized a chunk of answers or a block of answers and you come and you just spit it out during the exam, you will definitely get marked down. It's supposed to be spontaneous. So here, when we say memorize, do not memorize whole answers. Maybe just memorize a couple of phrases and words and things that you can use, especially for the opener introduction part, especially when it's part 2, so that you can just bring that in and it'll boost your score as well. All right, so for example, if you were to memorize a good opener, a good one would be like, I'd like to talk to you about ... whatever it is, a job that I used to do before, or a subject in school that I really enjoyed learning. Even better, you can go on to say something like, well, there are many subjects that I had to study in school. Let's take that example, subjects that I had to study in school, but I would say my most favorite one was math, for example. So the second sentence that we used would boost your score a little more because you're developing the sentence and you're paraphrasing here and there, which brings me to the next tip, which is paraphrase the topic. All right, so let's just discuss what paraphrasing means. Paraphrasing means just saying the same thing in a different way. So for example, in the exam, if you get describe a beautiful place to visit in your country, and you go and say, today I'm going to describe a beautiful place to visit in India, right? You have just lifted the same words from the question and you've repeated it. Instead of doing that, a better way of saying it is, I'm going to talk about a stunning destination which people can travel to toward the south of India. So you've changed the sentence around, you've paraphrased it, and you're not exactly saying and lifting from the question. You're saying what is there in the question in another way. So that really boosts your score as well. All right, so make sure you learn how to paraphrase words and sentences. All right. Next tip would be keep talking. So what happens is 2 minutes might seem like a lot of time, but again, if you're not used to speaking for 2 minutes without any interruptions, it could seem like you're talking for a very long time or feel like you're speaking for a very long time. But you need to make sure that you are speaking for the full 2 minutes. If you go over, that is okay, because what happens is, since this is a very strict time exam, the examiner will stop you. The examiner has a stopwatch with them. And once you cross 2 minutes, they will interrupt you and say, okay, we'll move on. All right, so make sure that you are constantly talking and filling in that time so that you'll be able to fit as much as you can, again, correct information and correct grammar and everything, and keep talking for the full 2 minutes. All right. Here's another tip. While you're preparing, again, there might be a cue card where you don't know what to talk about. You don't know what to fill in. You don't know what to say. You can make it up if you need to. All right. It's okay to lie during this exam. All right. The examiner is not going to go fact check what you're saying. They are just looking at how well you're speaking and if you're speaking correctly. So it doesn't matter what you're saying. If you do not have a favorite subject, or if you haven't traveled, let's say the question is about traveling, speak about a holiday that you've taken and you haven't really gone anywhere. All right, you can just make it up. Bring in your future, or like something, a wish that you had, and say, okay, I have traveled here, and just put and talk about that. So again, you can make it up. All right, and also another tip is that you can ask for clarification if needed. All right, if you don't understand what the examiner is saying, or if you don't know what to say, the examiner, you can just ask the examiner and they'll be able to help you. They'll probably reword the question, or they will probably repeat it. All right, so it's totally fine to ask for clarification if you need it. All right, so here are some tips. As well as when you're practicing, make sure you remember these tips so that when you're there on the day for your speaking exam, it'll go by really easily. All right, so now let's get on to today's talk about learning how to answer part 2 of the IELTS speaking section. Alrighty, so here's a strategy that you can use before we go on to that. You can use this strategy where we have the introduction, the past, the description, opinions, and future. So if you follow this kind of strategy, it will be easier when you're taking notes. So once you get your cue card, just go ahead and like maybe put these down as well: introduction, past, description, opinion, future, as well as the prompts that are there, and make sure you kind of fit them in. So introduction, you can probably have a few introductory phrases or what you're going to talk about in the introduction. Okay, and then you can talk about the past tense or in the past. So if it's a question like we discussed, if it's a subject that you enjoyed learning, past tense, or a job you had done or a place you had visited, all right, make sure you know the tense so that you can bring it in, because the examiner will be looking at the tenses you're using, and that will definitely boost your score if you are using them correctly. All right, then we look at the description. So once you have given your point, you start to describe. So if you're, again, speaking about a subject which you enjoyed, if it's something like math, you can put in all of different facts there. Math really has intrigued me as a subject. I really love solving problems and finding out what x equals and what y equals, etc. All right, describe why you liked it or whatever the question asked you. Give your opinion. You can also talk about, maybe you can branch it out and say, if it's something to do with a school subject, and school, if you ask, you can give your opinion and say something like, if you ask me, I would really like to go back to my school days and learn all over again, etc. So you kind of go back in the future or give your opinion in some way. And future, again, bring in some kind of future point. So you can follow this strategy while you're preparing for your speaking section 2. All right. Okay. Now, here's an example that we're going to do together and how we're going to learn how to answer this. So the question, this is an example of what the cue card can look like. All right. So it's part 2, individual long-term candidate task card. You'll have the box. And the question here is, describe a holiday that you had recently enjoyed, that you recently enjoyed. All right, that's the question. Describing a holiday that you had that you really enjoyed. So it's past tense. All right. And then you should say, so they're giving you prompts. Now, the thing is, one more thing that I missed mentioning is the prompts that are there, you do not have to speak about them. They are just there for your guidance and for your reference, and to give you that little boost, to give you a start about what to talk about. You can definitely add more things into it, or you don't even have to speak about that, but make sure you're speaking about something. All right, so the prompts that we have here are, you should say when you went, where you went, who you went with, and explain why you enjoyed it so much. All right, and now you can see you have the instructions at the bottom. You will have to talk about the topic for 1 to 2 minutes, usually 2 minutes. You have 1 minute to think about what you're going to say, and you can make some notes to help you if you wish. All right, so I have the timer here. Let's see what we can make notes on. All right, going to start the timer. All right, so first of all, when I'm making notes, I'm going to talk about first point, which is when. I'm going to jot down some keywords like when did I go on the trip? So I'm going to talk about the time in the summer, about 10 years ago in July. All right, this is when we went on the trip. So I've got when covered. All right, now where, looking at this point here, where you went. So I'm going to talk about a specific country, the country that I went to. So it was in Europe. I went to a couple of different countries. So I'm going to talk about going to Italy and Greece and France and how we went there. All right. Who I went with my family. So I'm going to talk about that. All right. I'm going to say why I enjoyed it so much. So I'm going to talk about new experiences and new cultures, probably about the food and meeting new people. Okay, some phrases I'd say is today I'd like to tell you about a vacation or at the time of my life. And in addition, I would probably visit again and would like to visit other places as well. So I've covered the future. So hang on, I know the timer is over. Let's just go through this one more time. All right, so here we can just say, instead of 10 years ago, we can probably use a better way of saying it would be a decade ago. All right, so when you're talking, make sure you kind of go one step higher and revamp your words and make it a little bit one step higher. Okay, let's talk about the phrases. Today, I'd like to tell you about a vacation where I had the time of my life. All right, so here we did a bit of paraphrasing. All right, the question is describe a holiday you had that you really enjoyed. And so instead of just saying, I'd like to tell you about a holiday that I went on that I really enjoyed, very boring. Let's take it up a notch and say, today I'd like to tell you about a vacation, holiday vacation, all right, where I had the time of my life. All right, that's another way of saying enjoyed, okay? And it's also an idiom, it's an idiomatic phrase, all right? And we use that, so that will kind of boost our score. And some additional points as well that I've added in would be like if I wanted to visit again, if I would visit again, and the other places that I would want to visit as well. So I'm kind of bringing in the future tense. So I'm showing the examiner that there's a past and there's a future. And if I can bring in the present, I'll bring in the present. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead. Let's start the timer for 2 minutes and I'll give you an example of how we can talk about this question right here, describing a holiday that I really enjoyed. Let's go. And the timer starts now. All right, so today I'd like to talk to you about a vacation where I had the time of my life. I went on this vacation with my family, that's my mom and my dad, and we went around a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, in the summertime. It was around July, I think, and actually it was my birthday, and we had done this vacation, my parents had planned this vacation for my 16th birthday, and we had planned to go on a cruise, and it was a cruise towards the European countries. So we covered Italy, we covered Greece, we covered France, we covered Turkey, and what we really enjoyed was we went from India and we took a flight, we reached Italy, and from there we got onto the cruise ship, and from there the cruise ship, it was a 5-day cruise, and they took us to all these different countries. And what I really enjoyed about this trip and what made it most memorable for me was that after a long time I had traveled outside of India and I had experienced new cultures. I was able to meet new people, and the people that I met in the various countries were very nice and very helpful, and it was really great to understand them and understand their culture. Also, I am a big foodie, so I got to experience different cuisines and the different culture cuisines, especially in Italy. I got to have the authentic Italian pizza, and Greece, they're known for their Greek salad, so I got to experience that. And especially in France, got to experience that wide culture and their food, and it really made me feel really great that I got to experience it. And as well as meeting new people, we had a whole bunch of friends there, so I wasn't feeling very out of place there. And if you had asked me, I would love to visit these countries again, but I would also like to visit other countries as well, probably during the rest of Europe as well. All right, that was 2 minutes that we covered. All right, We spoke about when, we spoke about where, we spoke about who, we spoke about why, we used some different phrases. We talked about the past, we talked about the present, we talked about the future. And did you see that 2 minutes kind of went by a little fast? Now, again, if you're not very fluent in your speaking, what you can do is practice, 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 and make sure that you are covering that 2 minutes of time. All right. And the only way you'll be able to do that is if you practice. So a little advice, you can practice with your family or your friends, sit them down. If you have your exam coming up, sit them down, practice with them, get them to ask you questions, do a little bit of role playing, get them to be the examiner, answer their questions, practice with them. And if you don't have anybody who you can practice with, practice in front of the mirror so that you boost your confidence. Because what happens is when you're practicing, especially for speaking, what happens is you'll develop your fluency and your coherence, so you won't be stuttering so much. And when you're speaking, it'll just be smooth. All right. And also, yes, keep an eye on the time. Make sure that you're covering all the points in 2 minutes. If by chance you have covered everything on your note paper when you've taken notes and you are unsure of what to add and you still maybe have 30 seconds, try and just think of something very quickly. If anything at all, if you haven't covered the future part of it, cover the future part. All right. If you've just stuck to the questions that were given in the prompts for you, go ahead and talk about the future. So if I had said everything that I wanted to say, so let's say I cover the when, the where, the who, the why, all right, and then I still had 30 seconds left, I would have just thought about it and then brought in, okay, I would like to visit this country again, or I would like to tour the rest of Europe and understand more and experience new cultures and new cuisines and things like that. So you can just go ahead. But make sure you use that 1 minute preparation time very wisely. All right, you saw how fast that 1 minute went when we were preparing. So again, always practice, practice, practice. Do a whole bunch of past papers and make sure that you are confident and fluent and ready to take your speaking exam. All right, now we are on to the audience Q&A time where you can just ask your questions. All righty, you can ask your questions. Okay, again, we can just talk about the poll question as well. What do you find most difficult about the IELTS speaking section? More into part 2. Again, where you might not have enough to speak about and that you might find that difficult, or you might be nervous or conscious, or you don't know what to speak about, or if there's anything else, go ahead and tell us. Okay, so we've covered if you don't have enough to speak about, remember, you should just be practicing, practicing, practicing all the time. And make sure that on the day you have enough, even if you are not able to cover, maybe you have written too much and you're not able to cover it, that's fine, but make sure you have enough or even more to speak about. Because again, like we discussed, this is a very strict timed exam. So if you have spoken over 2 minutes, the examiner will stop you. So don't worry about speaking too much. If you're under, what happens is silence will be there and you'll be docked down in your score. And you don't really want that because even a half band score makes a lot of difference. So make sure you just keep talking. All right. Again, with nervousness and conscious, the only way again is to practice. Make sure that you are practicing either in front of the mirror or with your friends and family so that you're getting rid of that conscious state or that nervous state and you'll be able to speak. All right. Again, you don't know what to speak about. If you are unsure when you get your topic paper, you can just make it up. Make up something that just comes into your head and just talk about that. All right, so practice doing that as well. Okay, so some advice when you're practicing, if you get a cue card and you don't know how to answer the question, don't research about it. Just think about the first thing that comes into your mind. It might be like, again, for that example that we've taken, you might not have traveled somewhere. So just make it up. You can say, something like, I have traveled, even if you, okay, let's say that you wanted to go to London. So you can just make it up and say the last holiday that I had was at London, and you would know a few facts about London. So just put in something about that in there. All right. Okay, so I think that's the end of today's talk. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you were able to learn how to answer part 2 of the IELTS speaking exam. Do join us For more talks just like these, we'll have some upcoming talks as well, and you can check that out on nebula.com. All right, if you found this talk helpful for you, and if you have friends who are preparing for the exam as well, do share this with them. You will be notified when the recording is available, so you can always go back and have a look at this. All right, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll see you next time.